Thank you, Amy and Guy, first of all, for coping so well with the time limit. So I think that we are setting now a very good and stimulating precedent for other panels as well. And also thank you for exploring two of the main sources that Professor Uriel had used and to offer us some new interpretations and to share with us some of their thoughts regarding the use of these sources. So in Amy's case, we move to the Mühimme documents, one of the main sources used by Head to study local history, in his case, Ottoman Palestine. Amy, who actually began her academic career studying also Jerusalem and its region, moved in this paper and in her research in general from Jerusalem to Edirne, and today we heard about one volume of the Mühimme documents from this major Ottoman city. And indeed the question that raises in this paper, where is Edirne in the narratives of Ottoman history, seems at first glance to be very clear on, but I think as Amy's paper shows very well, is far from being evident. Furthermore, if we compare what Amy does with this source to what Uriel did at his time, I think that her paper very well displays the shift from diplomatic, military, and later on demographic and economy history to writing social and cultural history. And in Edirne case, I think that this shift is very well presented by the shift from studying the summer campaign, what we used to do in the past, actually to the winter activities, which were very much different, but still very significant to our understanding of Ottoman history. So it's not only shift in places, but also in seasons, and I think this is a very promising direction. And again, one of the major topics that come up in her paper is those hunting expeditions that to a large extent remain very much in the shadow in the past. And today, Amy, in her paper, she shows how actually studying these hunting expeditions raises questions like spending leisure time, what is the meaning of leisure time, what its purposes, power relations and legitimacy, hierarchy, military training, but also enables us to think more thoroughly about the major question, what it meant to be a capital city, let's say, before the conquest of Constantinople in 1453. This paper, at least I found a lot of things to ask. I try to limit myself to just a few of them. One is very anecdotal, I suppose. When we think about Edirne during the winter time, of course, to my mind comes the Eyal Ginio, those famous competitions of wrestling with oil, something that is still done for tourists today in Edirne, a custom that began for very similar reasons to the hunting expeditions already in the 14th century. So I just wonder, I suppose that in this volume nothing came out regarding these competitions, but if you could share some information about them at this very early period. The other question is much more general. I think that you convinced us very well that taking into account the mobility of the Ottoman court and the Ottoman government at the time, it's very hard to speak about Edirne as a unique capital city of the Ottoman state at the time. And indeed, if we look at the maps that you showed us previously, places like Demotica, that even today prides itself very much of its imperial Ottoman history, so should we limit ourselves to Edirne, or should we speak about a more broader region that includes other major Ottoman places like Demotica, when we reflect about the roles and about the use of the term capital city at this early period? Another general question in the paper, at least Amy speaks very frankly about the fact that archives sometimes disappoint us. It's something that I suppose all of us came at some stage. We're building all kinds of projects, ideas, and hopes regarding our sources, and then we come, retrieve them, and to our disappointment, many of the things that we intended to find are actually not there. And if we are going back to the early Ottoman period, before the Başbakanlık archives supposed to give us all answers, I suppose that we should also speak about non-archival sources, especially archaeology. I suppose Amy mentions in the paper that many of the mosques that were established during this period later on went through all kind of restorations, etc. So what we see today is very different from what they saw in the 14th century. But still, I suppose archaeology could and should give us some answers regarding the early Ottoman period. And of course, and you gave us one example in your paper, the use of non-Ottoman sources. So should we, as Ottomanists who study this period, study also Greek, Bulgarian, etc., in order to construct the more general picture. Guy as well is moving to one of the sources that was studied by Professor Head, the Fetava collections, and their ability to shed some lights on here, not Ottoman societies in general, but on the history of the ulama and their understanding and use of Ottoman law. One of the major topics that I found very interesting is the relations and the distinctions between the Arabic-speaking provinces and the Turkish-speaking provinces, or as it comes very clearly in his paper, those who studied actually in Cairo and Al-Azhar, who shaped their view in these places, the Arabic-speaking ulama, and mufti in this case, and those who were raised in the Turkish-speaking provinces and studying mostly in Istanbul, and to some extent also in Edirne and Bursa, two centers that, as you showed us, developed sometimes, not always, different styles, but also perceptions and even sometimes conventions. So first of all, Guy showed us that the boundaries were much more flexible than we think. Scholars like Abdul Rahim moved between the two centers. After all, Istanbul and not Cairo offered much more thought of careers, etc. So often it was mandatory also to be in Istanbul if one sought after careers in the administrations, etc. And you use the term Ottomanized jurists, that of course I think very clearly displays this understanding. So of course these two centers raise some questions. One is, I suppose, could you try to trace some imaginary boundaries where the, let's say, the influence, the significance of Cairo ends and the one of Istanbul begins? Would you place it in Aleppo, north of Aleppo? I wonder where it would be placed exactly. Most of the examples that you give us show people who moved from the Arab provinces to Istanbul, and as I said, it makes a lot of sense. Did you come across the opposite cases? People are coming from Rumeli, from Anatolia, to study in Cairo or elsewhere in the Arab lands. Some of the debate between the two centers is also very interesting. I think that the one that is centered about the legitimacy of the money endowments is very well known, and different taxes that were very much opposed on the basis of the Sharia in the provinces. But you mentioned actually a debate on the Tajdidi Iman. You just mentioned it in passing, and I wonder if you could say something about it, because I found it very intriguing. And last but not least, what you presented to us at the end of your presentation is the rise of a new genre, a new way of compiling these collections that seems to display kind of wish to imply standardization of the source, etc. Could you say something about, if you find any social, economic, political explanations that could explain this change of compiling these collections? So these are my comments and questions, and before letting the two speakers to answer them, I open the floor for other comments. I think that it would be a good idea to collect some of them and then to let Amy and Guy to answer. Chaim, please. Could you speak to the micro so we could hear you?
One question to Amy. I think you didn't mention the fact that seems to be called for in such a paper that Edirne became the capital of the Ottoman Empire in the 17th century. For about a quarter of a century, I think, until the 1703 infamous incident that was mentioned. And it became, well, it overshadowed Istanbul in this period, like France moving the capital to Lyon. Is this thinkable at all? So it certainly is a major event in Ottoman cultural history. And I would think that the whole incident and its implication and meaning should have a repercussion on what you said on the earlier centuries. I think so. Thank you.
Mina, please.
My question is to Guy Burak, and I follow your comments. First of all is the issue of standardization. If you compare the development of Hebrew law to the development of the Fetava collections, there is a parallel. In the second half of the 16th century, there was started a tendency to standardize the Hebrew law. After the Shulchan Aruch was printed, all other collections of responsa were sorted out and presented the way the Shulchan Aruch was. So there is, I think, that there is a sort of a natural development of legal sources, if you look at them through their history. So what's your opinion about it? The second thing is connected to the dissemination and the use of these collections. It's rather interesting to see that once Hebrew responsa collections started to appear, they have been used all over Jewish diaspora, and especially after the printing press was introduced, but even before that. And I ask myself, and I ask you, whether the reason was really the printing or the common language, but I reckon that any Alim knew Turkish and Arabic as well. So what is your opinion about it?
Thank you. Please, Nili.
I'm fascinated by what I've heard, and I follow up a question of Mina with regard to the relationship between provincial and central law, because from your lecture I understood that the compilations were mainly provincial. So did they reflect a kind of an ethnic autonomy of the provinces, similarly to the autonomy granted to to religious communities? And another question is, what is the relation? Was there any central superior law which dominated the whole empire?
Thank you. Miri, please.
This session is about sources and methodology. I would like to ask both of you, you are trying to look at patterns and things that are regular in the sources. What we can learn from the fact that a certain collection is organized in a certain way. But we also know that both the Fetava and certainly the Mühimme is highly not organized. It's very random the way the entries were entered into the Mühimme and the Fatwa collection. If there was no child in the family who would take upon himself to collect the entries, we wouldn't have that collection. So it's highly random. So how do you reconcile this random, these basic characteristics of randomness while trying to look for patterns that have a meaning?
Amnon, please.
I have, thank you for the presentations, and I have quite a number of questions. I'll take just one, and it's hypothetical in Amy mentioned that out of 500 firmas, there are 3 concerning Edirne, which she actually was interested in. And my question concerns another source which wasn't consulted, but the question is whether you tried, Amy, or maybe Guy has anything to say about it, and that's the Sigil collection. From my knowledge of what's going on, or what was supposed to be going on in Istanbul, was that there has been for quite a while a drive to collect the collections of sigilat from the various centers in Anatolia. The question is whether you know of, because if it doesn't exist, it's a pity. If it exists, it's even worse, because then questions are raised. For instance, the point that you mentioned about these hunting delegations or hunting sessions or hunting excursions, they took along with them quite a number of professionals from town. Question whether it had any effect on the makeup of the daily or the routine activity in town. And these are questions that could be asked only, one could hope to find an answer to only through sigil collections. So that's my question. Thank you.
It's a question to Guy Burak. Is it possible to characterize the ways in which Feyzullah used earlier collections of Hanafi fatwas?
Thank you. Please, Evgeny.
Actually, to follow up, if I may, and your question, my question is the following. The Ottomans are trying to standardize, they are trying to do their best, and then they are promoting local collections. Is this collection very local? Does it refer to custom? Does it have different stuff that the local Qadi should be aware of before they are making their decisions? And this is why it would be, there is a utility in this local collection coming into place. That would be my question.
Thank you. I think that we already accumulated enough questions, so you have a lot to answer, and then we will have another round of questions if necessary.
One more, if I may.
Please.
By the way, one comment. On the map, this is the actual way to go down from the Greek side, from Edirne today to Salonika. It's exactly
This
the
is
same road.
itinerary.
Exactly. And the question is, they go hunting, but do they go for fun? I mean, have you looked into whether some of the decisions they are making are decisions that they meet people that they cannot meet where they are, and they have to meet hunting, and they take decisions that they are not possible to take if they were sitting in the center. So the other way around. So that's my question. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So, Amy, please.
Right. So, thank you for the comments, everyone. I'll go in order. Chaim, absolutely. I think that one of my basic points is that once you start to look at Edirne and focus on it, it, I think, really calls into question the way we've structured our understanding of what the Ottoman capital is, of what an Ottoman capital is. And I think that this goes also to, so this goes also to just to Eyal's comments also. The fact that they could move the capital to Edirne in the second half of the 17th century, when Mehmed IV becomes Sultan, I think is indicative of the fact that Edirne has never been not an Ottoman capital. I think that that's what the patterns that I begin to see about them spending long periods in the winter in Edirne basically says to us is that in the general appreciation of what these cities mean, Edirne is a capital city. I think Bursa is a capital city. It's the necropolis. It's where the tombs of the first sultans are, all the way up through Mehmed the Conqueror. And from Eyal's own work about what happens in the Balkan Wars and then in the First World War, when Edirne is taken and a huge amount of effort is made to retake it more than once, for symbolic reasons, not because it's a great city anymore, but partly because it's unthinkable that Edirne would not be part of the Ottoman Empire. So I think that your point is absolutely in keeping with the way my thoughts have been flowing, and the fact that Edirne, and this I think then also goes to Eyal, was your question about your comment about Dimetoka, right? So the fact that when Edirne seems to be the most frequently the capital in the first half of the 15th century, it's where diplomacy takes place, it's where the army basically is formed every campaign season, it's where the big parties are happening. If you're going to throw a big party, you throw it in Edirne, kind of by the 1430s. And even after Constantinople is conquered, Edirne remains the place where you throw a big feast. Mehmed has his own son circumcised in Edirne, not in Istanbul, because Istanbul isn't ready to host a big party in the late 1450s when he wants to do this. So Edirne is very much this official space, but Dimetoka at the same time is a key private space. It's apparently, from some hints that I've seen in chronicles, so again, to talk about sources, I think that the fact that we're bereft of documents in the first half of the 15th century and in the 14th century certainly sends us back to chronicles in a way that's very much in keeping with the literary turns and the cultural turns that we've seen now. So you have people like Kastritsis and others who are really plundering those sources now with literary analysis of a different kind and a different reading to try and understand what we can learn. So Dimetoka is where the harem is, it's where the family is, it's where the treasury is kept for quite some time apparently, because it's very high, it's very well fortified, you don't have to expend a huge amount of manpower keeping things safe there. And Voltaire actually makes that very clear in his description of Dimetoka as they go through. So I think that your point is well taken, and then the question really is, after the 1703 crisis, starring Guy's Feyzullah Efendi, they retreat from Edirne. They seem to retreat from Edirne, abandon Edirne for the most part, and Edirne then falls partly into ruin by the mid-18th century when it also suffers several earthquakes, and then only comes back kind of into focus in the 19th century, but then in a very different way and not as an imperial space at all, and the sultans aren't going there anymore. So that's what I would say about those things. So Miri, I think the question is really an interesting way to put it, that looking for patterns in sources. I think that my point would be more that I'm looking for patterns across sources. I'm looking for things that keep coming up, but in different kinds of contexts. So the hunting, the fact of people moving in and out of Edirne in different ways, and looking at the patterns of how they move in and out of the city, rather than which source it is that's telling us this. And one of the really interesting things about the randomness is that the survival of this particular volume, which is the earliest that we have of Mühimme, which also should lead us to ask the question, is it the earliest that we have? Is it among the first ones that were ever compiled? How far back did they go? We don't really know about that, and we make some assumptions about it. But okay, so when did collecting this way start? And both Haid and people who've written about the Mühimme later say, have noticed these volumes didn't start out as volumes. So you can look at volumes like the Defterleri, which started out as volumes. They were bound and then they were written in. That's not the case with the Mühimme. It seems like they were written and then they were bound. And the really big unknown is, okay, but who bound them first? So I think that, and so the randomness of this one volume, which deals with the winter, is, wow, it's all about the winter, and it's only about Edirne in terms of where these things are originating from, but they're going all over the empire, which to me gives me more for my winter pattern, and also then for my mobile capitals pattern. So that's the way I think about this. Amnon, Edirne sigils. The man who knows most about Edirne sigils is actually sitting right behind me. His name is Burak, and he is a visitor here, and he'll be a Lady Davis Fellow at the Hebrew University starting in the fall. And if I remember from our conversations, the Edirne sigils, that is these legal protocols, are from the volumes we have, they are entirely terekeh. They are only registrations of people who are of deceased people's properties. So they're estates, right? So they're basically estate descriptions until the early 18th century. So yes, we've got lots of volumes. No, they're not like the ones that we have in Jerusalem. So people have looked at them, but you would have to kind of figure out what questions you could ask in order to learn something there. As for the professionals, though, one of the other orders from this volume has to do with preparing to go on campaign. So the volume ends in the month of April, and one of the latest orders there is a list of the professionals from Edirne who ought to be ready to depart with the army. 144 of them in different categories. And that then leads us to ask, okay, well, if 144 people from the sort of general pool of people who are artisans, craftsmen, people in the markets, are supposed to leave now with the army for several months, how many are there to begin with? Like, how big a kind of craft artisan market population are we talking about? Or is that the wrong way to look at it? And is the town of Edirne kind of like your average beach resort town, whereas it sort of functions seasonally? And then it functions in a very different way off-season. And then what is the season and what's the off-season? And we don't understand that, but just by thinking about the question, it forces you to overturn everything you assumed that you understood. So that's the way I look at that. Hunting for fun. I'm very persuaded by Tulay Artan's work that hunting is not for fun. I mean, it's for fun, but it's for practicing. It's for getting out there and riding around together, making sure everybody knows their job and does it correctly. Do I trust the guys on my left and right? Like, can they really hold a bow? The idea that maybe they're having meetings kind of back channel, I've never thought of, and that's really kind of a subversive idea. I'm not sure how it would be documented, but it's definitely something to look for now. Right, okay, to look, right, okay, so to plot that, okay, right, okay.
And Amy, could I just ask you again about the significance of non-textual sources for this period, our ability to use archaeology, for example?
So some of the most interesting work done on the first half of the 15th century is done by people who are trained as archaeologists or art historians, who've mapped Edirne, mapped the entire space of Edirne in terms of the buildings. And those footprints are immovable, so it's actually pretty easy to understand where the boundaries of the 15th century city are and how they expanded. So yes, archaeology, art history, I think probably climatology is going to have to come into it. Starting from the earliest end, we know that in the latest Byzantine period that there was enormous destruction in Thrace. The Catalans talk about how, well, basically we lived off the land until there wasn't anything left, and then we moved on further in Thrace. And I need to learn what that means environmentally, like how long does it take a place to recover from that level of destruction. The Ottomans were campaigning through Thrace, which brought its own level both of destruction and then regularization. So I think that we need to be much more flexible, and then also just to go back to the textual sources that we have, which are problematic because they're later, and learning how to read Ottoman poetry so that we can incorporate that. I think Nicolas Trépanier's work on 14th century Anatolia is very clever for the way he's kind of gotten inside of an entire consumption culture through reading poetry and using archaeology. So, yes.
Thank you. Guy, please.
I'll divide the questions into two. I think there are several overarching things. So the first is the question.
Could you speak just to the micro? Thank you.
Okay, so the first is the question of geographical boundaries and the local and the provincial. And to me, it's less a matter of geography and much more a question of the institutional spread of certain practices. It's much more a matter of authority, what kind of institutions are invested with what kind of authority, and what is the geographical outreach or spread of these institutions, assuming that you can be trained in Istanbul and spend most of your careers in Mecca, Jerusalem, wherever. So it's not so much a matter of drawing a line between Anatolia and the Arab provinces. That said, there are local traditions or traditions that are at least associated with or were more popular in certain parts of the empire, in part because of the same issues of authority. You have more people starting in Al-Azhar or in Cairo, in the Arabic-speaking provinces than in Istanbul. And yes, there is an asymmetry. There are always people going in both directions. I think there are more people going from the Arab provinces to Istanbul, at least institutionally speaking. And usually people that go from Istanbul and stay in the Arab provinces are dropouts or people that something happened, like in the famous stories Al-Khafaji from the 17th century, and also Arabs rarely made it to the higher echelons, as much as John and others have shown. So this is why I don't think of the provincial collections in terms of ethnic collections. I think that first, to what extent Muslim or Islamic law can be ethnicized in a self-proclaimed Muslim empire. That's a question. But there are local in the sense that they recognize local practices, and this is why these collections, as opposed to the grand narratives or the theory of fact, they are not stripped out of local identifiers. So we know where the facts came from. We know, in some cases they say this is the practice of this land, and so on and so forth. As to general imperial laws, so yes, I think there is a sense of an Ottoman way of doing things, and I think that these provincial collections, in a way, are a product or an extension of this imperial law. So I don't think that the dichotomy is necessarily helpful or valid. As to how to Feyzullah use previous, it's a very different project. I would just say that his autobiography clearly shows that he thought very highly of himself. let's say that his downfall was richly deserved. But it's also kind of interesting that it's very difficult to be, I was telling Evgeny this morning, it is very difficult to be an egomaniac in a tradition. So it's an interesting tension. So he clearly accepts the previous authorities, but he also thinks that he's a very, very important innovator in this process. This question of randomness is something that I'm very interested in, and I would think that the important thing is making the distinction between randomness in terms of survival, things that end up, which is very contingent, and projects that explicitly say we should preserve certain things. Whether they succeed or not, it's a somewhat different story, and that's kind of that may allow us to reconcile the patterns on the one hand and a historical reality, or a reality that we are facing, that these things have, for some reason, not survived. The renewal of faith, it's an ongoing debate between jurists from the members of the learned hierarchy and jurists from mostly from the Arab lands, about there is an Ottoman practice that if you say certain things, you are not explicitly, blasphemy, you are not explicitly, you are not denounced as an infidel, but you are in a limbo where you can actually renew your faith, which is something that the Ottomans developed for numerous reasons. The leading jurists from the Arab provinces, like Eyal Ginio, find very difficult to swallow, and they reject this practice. And you can really trace through these controversial concepts who follows what. And there might be less controversial issues that are also there. So,
yeah, I open the floor to another round of questions. So, Amy, please.
So I have a question. I have a question for Guy. It was, I have to say, mind-blowing to think of Feyzullah as anything else but an egomaniac who, deserved his own downfall, as you say. And it made me realize that we're so used to focusing on his corruption and the way he promoted really his undeserving children and other people, that we don't focus on him and the fact that he did come through a particular training. So do you have any sense of what he thought these compilations would then do? Like what was going to be the purpose of this, or why was he going to create a local archive of decisions? And I wonder, since you started out with Jerusalem, whether there's any way to tie this then to what's going to happen in a couple of years, which is the Mered Nakib al-Ashraf, as we call it, the revolt of the Nakib al-Ashraf in Jerusalem, who, as far as I remember, there's a tie to Feyzullah there, because it's his appointee, I think. Excuse me? Right. So I wondered, if you could say something more just about what Feyzullah really thought he was up to, if we do take him as a serious jurist and not as just an egomaniac.
And Guy, maybe I also would like to remind you about Mina's question about this trend of standardization that comes in Jewish sources at the same time. Any more questions? Chaim, please.
Incredibly good scholar. I know it's a puzzle how to explain it, but that's the fact. Not less than Ali Efendi, same level as far as I could understand it. Ali Efendi at the top. Thank you.
Thank you. Please.
Question to Amy. What do you deduce from the fact that major issues that had to do with the movement from Istanbul to Edirne, such as the housing of the poor, because they were loath to take out locals that Christian travelers and Jewish sources describe, to house the people that came with the Sultan and the soldiers, major problems in the city, do not appear at all as if they are non-existent. What does it show either on the attitude of the central government? Probably they were not interested in it and they left it to some other, I don't know, powers to handle, or it is just occasional.
Thank you. Any? Avi.
My question to Guy and Justin is, Guy, would you go as far as offering some general observation about the transition to modernity? I mean, based on, because of course when you're talking about standardization, so one of the hallmarks of modernity is standardization, of course, and then it's all stemming from the state and going back to the state, and so on and so forth. So would you call it perhaps, or see in it, early signs of a consciousness of modernity? I know, I mean, I'm not suggesting that you go into the business of looking for roots and harbingers and all that. But I wonder if you have this sort of thought.
Thank you. Amy, please.
Okay. Yossi, I understood you, the question is about moving from Istanbul to Edirne and the impact on the city.
Yeah.
Okay. So, first, I think that this is the way I envisage it. First of all, there's an enormous palace in Edirne, huge, which was blown up or set on fire and then blew up when the Ottomans retreat from Edirne in 1877. And it burns. And because it's basically it's deteriorated to the point where it's being used as an ammunitions depot. So once it gets set on fire, it really burns. And then in the wake of the Ottoman recovery of Edirne, the mayor of Edirne invites the people of the town and of the surrounding towns to come and plunder the palace for stone to rebuild. And it takes a while before somebody wakes up to the fact that that might not have been the best idea, and they stop. So there are actually excavations now going on about this palace, of which we have illustrations. So we know a fair amount about what it looked like, at least in its latest incarnation before it burned. But we do know, we have a lot about the building of that palace, repairs to the palace, and so it was quite a huge space. That's one. So the Ottomans travel with an entourage. The question of how much of Istanbul goes with Edirne is an interesting one. I haven't worked on the early 18th century yet, but it is a kind of truism handed down that one of the reasons for the Edirne incident is because the merchants of Istanbul have grown very, very angry at the fact that business that they used to get in Istanbul now goes to Edirne because the court is in Edirne. I'm not sure how much that holds once you start to take a look, particularly if this is a regular migration. I think the part that's disturbing to people may be the fact that they're there year-round for decades. And that may be the most disruptive factor. The army. So I actually have thought about this a lot. I have a feeling that the army doesn't come into the city. I mean, if you collect tens of thousands of people to go on campaign, you really don't want these guys just roaming around the city. So I have a feeling that the camps are probably at a certain distance from the city that doesn't make it easy just to go into town for the afternoon.
The Hebrew sources tell us that Jews were driven out of their homes and soldiers came in.
When?
In the 17th century.
Okay, in the 17th century. So I've chiefly been looking at the 15th century and some at the 16th century. What we do understand is that there are significant changes in the 17th century, particularly all of the various kinds of disruptions that go along with what is sort of loosely categorized as the Jalali uprisings, but which probably doesn't deserve to be so loosely categorized. But it is a time when lots and lots of patterns have been disrupted. So I wouldn't assume that that's a constant at all, and I would look for the contingency of a particular event like that.
Thank you. Guy, please.
So first, to me it's very clear that Feyzullah was an exceptional jurist. I mean, it's also when you look at his rulings and his writings, his political ambitions aside, I mean, it's very clear that he has also a major intellectual project. And I think that most of the historiography about Feyzullah doesn't do justice to this aspect of Feyzullah. And to the question of the Nakib al-Ashraf, I don't know if it is related. There is something tempting about weaving this story into the age of Eyal historiography that I'm very hesitant. I would, to the extent I would link it, it seems much more related to that project of the Cohen of the 17th century leading to the, but I'm not sure. And I link Avi's and Mina's question about standardization, and if there is something natural here that so the easiest answer would be possibly, but I think that there are that it can easily be seen as a general trend that eventually you can trace back modern perceptions backwards and see that there is an earlier history. But when you look at it from that time onwards, I mean, I'm not sure that you can easily read it as, it can be a byproduct, an unintentional byproduct. But I'm wary of this of the historiography that looks at Ottoman Islamic law in the so-called early modern period as leading to the Majella, so I mean, but it's very much on my mind. And looking at parallel developments, so first, I would say yes, it makes sense to me that there are parallel developments, but I haven't seen the clear links, and I do think that the structure of authority is slightly different in the Jewish and the Ottoman world more generally. But in any case, I don't think it's a natural development. It's I think that very few developments. I mean, there were very major changes that were done after centuries of following other practices. I do think that Feyzullah understands that there are local traditions that needs to be addressed more systematically. But he's not the first to confirm the situation where there is, by the early 17th, 18th century or late 17th century, there are almost 2 centuries of locally appointed muftis that issue fatwas and write quite extensively. But I do think that he's different in the sense that he wants to canonize local practices in a slightly more systematic way.
Thank you so much, and I think that we are just on time ending this panel. So many thanks, Amy and Guy, for a very interesting panel.